are going to start today thank you, talking about Viola Liuzzo and Jonathan Daniels. Before we do get started, though, I want to point out that a couple of things. First of all, someone asked me recently, and that person is not here today, why I cared about all this stuff so much. I'm kind of wondering.
Discouraging question.
Well, it was kind of, but so I want to talk about that for just a second, and then we'll get started on Viola Liuzzo. There's several reasons why I care about this so much. Part of it is it's our history. I mean, this is where we lived, and in 1965 I was 9 years old, and I was living in Atlanta and totally oblivious to anything that was going on outside of my own little world. Now, I think part of that is that we didn't have the 24-hour news coverage then that we have now. But part of it was that it had nothing to do with our life. That's not true, but we lived as if it had nothing to do with our life. And that kind of amazes me, that I was growing up in suburban Atlanta and on the other side of town could have been a universe away what was going on. I don't know if any of you had that experience growing up or not. So that's part of it. Part of it is, I think that racism really is this country's original sin, and we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go, as the events of this week certainly show us that there is still a great divide. And there's many reasons for that. But it's not just history. It's going on now. And then the third reason is because I believe that part of the baptismal covenant that says we're supposed to respect the dignity of every human being. And, we do that with I do that with varying measures of success. But I believe that that's what we're called to do. And that this movement, especially, was a movement that was born in the church, and the church, if it weren't for the church, if it weren't more specifically for the black church, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement like we see. And there certainly wouldn't have been a nonviolent one. Up to this point, all the violence has not been from the black community, it's been from the white community. And so I think that that's all part of it. And I said before, and I'll say it again, and especially I'll talk about it some next week when we wrap up, that when I was walking on this road and sitting in the church, you could feel the power still, the power of the Spirit was there. And it wasn't just me feeling it, other people talked about it. And there was a Jewish woman, probably in her 70s, Holocaust survivor, family were Holocaust survivors. And she came up to me after, this is getting ahead to next week, but after something that happened on the fourth day, and she said, all my life I'm Jewish, but I'm not really, I'm culturally Jewish. I've never been a believer, and this week is making me change my mind about that, rethink that. One of my friends who is from California got in touch with me after the march, and she said, would you look at these websites of Episcopal churches around me and see which one you think might be the best fit? And she said, I've never been a churchgoer, but I want to go. There's something that was going on there that wasn't just me feeling it. People who had no background of faith or belief at all were changed by this week.
Just as an aside, did you find any church that might fit her?
There were a couple, so she's trying them out. So that's all why I care about this stuff. Viola Liuzzo, we're going to talk about today, and Jonathan Daniels. They were two of the people who are considered among the four martyrs of Selma. I want to say before we start talking about them, that if you go to Montgomery and there's a civil rights museum there, which is part of the Southern Poverty Law Institute. I didn't get to go into the museum because we didn't have time. We're going to go back this summer and go in. But on the outside of it, they have a civil rights memorial to the martyrs of the civil rights, and it's designed by the same woman who did the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. And if you look at it, you can tell it's kind of the same idea. There are 40 people whose names are inscribed on that list, and they died, I think, between 1955 and 1968. And if you Google, or I can make copies for you if you're interested, but if you Google civil rights martyrs, that's one of the first things that pops up from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they give a little brief summary of each person's life. There are, I think, 8 white people on that list, and the rest are African Americans.
Do they know what the Southern Poverty Law Center is?
Have you heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center? It's centered in Montgomery. It's run by a man named Morris Dees. They track hate groups in the country. They are the ones who have sued the Klan and kind of broken the Klan's back financially. They follow any kind of civil rights violations, not just racial, but they are now doing, of course, a lot of things with gays and lesbians, immigrants, anything that might be a civil rights violation. They do amazing work. They do a whole curriculum. There's an education piece. It's called Teaching Tolerance. They do curriculums for schools and churches to use. They do really, really good work, and they have to have enormous security around their building. Morris Dees, who we'll talk about a little bit next week because he spoke when we were in Montgomery when we got to Montgomery the last day. He gets death threats all the time. But they do really amazing work. So Google them and read about them, and you'll be impressed, I think. So when we're in Selma, the 4 who are considered the Selma martyrs, 3 of the 4 are white, and I'm aware that we're talking about white people when we're talking in this, but that is who died in this particular part of the civil rights movement. Viola Liuzzo was the only white woman who was a civil rights martyr. She was this daughter of a coal miner. Now, let me ask, how many of you have heard of Viola Liuzzo? Okay. She's probably the most well-known of the 4, and probably the most controversial of the 4, as we'll talk about. Going back to that, we're talking about white people. Somebody asked last week if Jimmy Lee Jackson's death got national coverage. It got a little bit, but not much. And one of the things I was reading this week said, someone made the comment, Lyndon Johnson sent flowers to Viola Liuzzo's husband after she died, and to Jim Reeves' wife after he died. Nobody sent flowers to Jimmy Lee Jackson's mother. That kind of shows the inequality there. But Viola Liuzzo was the daughter of a coal miner. She moved to Chattanooga when she was 6 and spent most of her childhood and adolescence there. So she was from Michigan, but she had experience of living in the South. And that greatly influenced her commitment to civil rights. She said she saw, when she lived in Tennessee, the unjustness of segregation and racism. Her family was desperately poor, but even desperately poor, they were better off than the most well-to-do black family. They could scrape together money to go to the movies every once in a while, and they got to go in the front door. They didn't have to go in the side door and sit in the balcony. So she realized that just the color of her family's skin gave them a status that black people were denied, even though her family was desperately poor. And she realized the inequity in that at a young age. They moved to Michigan when she was a teenager. She was always a bit impulsive. You know, we're going to see with her, especially, she was not a saint, which is okay. She dropped out of high school at age 14, and at age 16 she eloped, and then the next day she asked to have the marriage annulled. So she was impulsive. She married again at a very young age and had 2 children, divorced 7 years later, and then in 1950, when she was 25, her 3rd marriage, to Jim Liuzzo, who worked for the Teamsters in Detroit and had 3 more children. So she was 39 when she died. She'd been married 3 times and had 5 children. She lived a pretty eventful life in the short time that she lived. She was a community activist, particularly in civil rights and education. She regretted dropping out of school and really lobbied the local school board authorities to make it more difficult for kids to drop out of school. She did finish her high school education, and she was a student at Wayne State University when she died. So she realized the value of education and fought for that value, even though she herself was not particularly well educated. In 1964, she began attending the Unitarian Church and joined the NAACP in Detroit. She became good friends with a black woman named Sarah Evans, who she met in a grocery store. They became involved in civil rights together, and Evans eventually went to work as the Liuzzo's housekeeper, and after her murder, after Viola's murder, Sarah Evans became the children's permanent caregiver. So she really raised the children. Now when she died, her oldest children were already pretty much grown. They were 18, 19 years old. But the youngest one was only 6. So, what have y'all heard about her? You say you've heard things about her. Yeah, Shannon.
Well, NPR did a story on her about the time, I think the anniversary of her death, and this was maybe no more than 2 years ago, but they said things like the family had a tough time after that. The father, I think, certainly the 3 younger children, became an alcoholic, and one of the more endearing things about Viola was that she always went around in her bare feet. You know, she'd come in the front door and kick off her shoes. And the youngest daughter was interviewed, and I don't really remember what that was about. But I remember when she was killed. I remember sort of where we were and what we were doing. But like you know,
yeah.
It made national news.
Yeah, this one made national news, and not necessarily in a good way, which we're going to talk about.
Some of the interesting things about her to me were that she was always trying to help people. And I thought, or I think I had this opinion from before, that the reason she became active was because her husband was an organizer, a labor organizer. And
that was the Teamsters, yeah.
That was what originally got her kind of involved with it. But she was always the one that would do anything and go anywhere and help other people. But as I told you, I've really wrestled this week with the concept that my mother said to me, this is a woman who left 5 children without a mother. That's unacceptable. And to your point, nobody asked the men how many children they had.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot more about that.
Oh, and just one other aside about it. After her death, I think there was a media campaign, women's magazines, articles. Was she a good mother or was she not?
Ladies' Home Journal did a poll, and the overwhelming view was that she was not a good mother, which her children would disagree with.
But wasn't that from the FBI campaign?
Yeah, we're going to
smear her?
Yeah, and we're going to get into that. So, she was horrified by Bloody Sunday, and she was moved by King's speech, and LBJ Johnson gave a speech after after Bloody Sunday and after James Reed's death. And she was part of a group at Wayne State that was involved in civil rights issues in Detroit, which was a very racially divided city. I mean, it was as bad as any place in the South in terms of segregation. So, see some people from Michigan, if I'm wrong, tell me, but from what I've read.
It still is.
Still is. So she was involved in civil rights things, and I read this week that she met regularly. The chaplain at Wayne State University then was an Episcopal priest named Malcolm Boyd, who just recently died, who became very well known. And so he was very influential in her spiritual and activist development. She decided after hearing the speeches after Bloody Sunday that she needed to do something too. And she wrote, prior to today, and this was after, there's plenty of seats, Nancy. Prior to today, and this was after Johnson's speech, I felt that any personal contribution I might offer to those individuals in Selma was of little or no consequence. Nevertheless, upon reading the content of my president's speech today, I am no longer able to sit by while my people are suffering. She saw the people of Selma as her people. Go back to that baptismal covenant. She respected the dignity of every human being, and she felt called to go. Over the protests of her family, she got into her Oldsmobile and drove south alone. There were some others who said that they would go, and they backed out. She went by herself. She did promise her husband that she wouldn't participate directly in the march so that she would be safe. So when she got to Selma, and it took her 2 or 3 days to get there, but when she got there, she was put to work in logistics, registering people, helping arrange transportation, etc. She marched on the first day and the last day. Let's see what else we've got of her. That's her husband, Jim. Whoops. That's, well, I want to go back. That's the house that they lived in Detroit. So they were a middle-class family. Her husband had a good job. She worked usually until she decided to go back to school. Her husband was not involved in her actions or activism, but he was not unsupportive of it. He was the book I read about her says he was kind of bemused by it, but he understood that she needed to do it, and so he was supportive of it. And remember, this was 1965. The women's movement hadn't really gotten going yet. Here she is on the last day of the march, and she's barefooted. A lot of people walked barefooted parts of the march. I don't know how they did that, but some of them did it because they had to. So, the last day of the march, she was helping in the transportation section. And we'll see next week when I'm going to show you the 4th and 5th days of the march. The last day, they only had 3 miles to go, 3.5 miles to go from the city of St. Jude, which was a Catholic church and a lot of services, where they spent the night, the last night. That's actually in Montgomery, on the outskirts of Montgomery. From there to the state capitol is only about 3.5 miles. So she walked that last 3.5 miles. And then part of her duties, because she had a car, was that she would pick up marchers in Montgomery and take them back to Selma, or take them to the airport, or wherever they needed to go. So we had rented buses that took us where we needed to go. They didn't have that luxury, so they were dependent on volunteers with cars. So each volunteer was expected that day to make 2 round trips. It was 102 miles round trip. So she had made one trip and and taken some people from Montgomery back to Selma. Now she was headed back to Montgomery to pick up someone else. And in the car with her was Leroy Moten, who was a 19-year-old African-American man who was assigned to be with Liuzzo as her guide. So they tried to assign a local person with an out-of-town person. Let's see what I've got next. That's Leroy Moten. Okay, go back here. So while they are doing this, back in Selma, there were 4 members of the Klan who were at the Silver Moon Cafe, which was a known Klan hangout. And then Collie Wilkins, William Eaton, Eugene Thomas, and Gary Thomas Rowe. Elmer Cook, who you may remember, if you can keep all your Klan people straight, was the murderer of James Reeb, who we talked about last week, and that had happened just 2 weeks earlier. Came up to the 4 in the cafe and patted them on the back and said, "I did my job, now you go and do yours." Meaning he had killed his person, time for them to go do likewise. So they left the cafe. They saw Liuzzo and Moten at a stoplight and realized that they had their opportunity. They followed them across the Edmund Pettus Bridge onto Highway 80, which goes straight to Montgomery. And on Highway 80, she noticed that there was a car following them. It would speed up to her, then it would fall back. And then they were about 20 miles outside of Selma. It was getting dark. It was probably about 8:15, 8:30. This was before, so it wasn't the middle of the night, but this was in March before daylight savings time, so it was dark. And it's a very, even today, and it's a 4-lane highway now, it was just 2-lane then, but even with the 4-lane highway, we drove back at night one time from Selma to Montgomery, and it's dark, and there's nothing there. There are now a few convenience stores, but not many, so it's isolated.
So they were going back to
They were going back to Montgomery. Now, a white woman and a black man together alone in a car was a red flag. I mean, just like waving a red cloth in front of a bull to the Klan. That was the worst.
Well, so they
possibly
must
be.
have known this before they took this journey together,
Okay, so don't fall into the trap of
Sorry.
blaming the victim.
No, I mean,
Okay.
that's a good point, but I mean, they must have known this. I'm not blaming them, but they must have known it was dangerous.
Well, they did, but let's face it, Viola Liuzzo was from a different part of the country.
Well,
And I think she probably really didn't get
just how
how
dangerous
it
it was.
was.
Well, I'll also
He must
say-
have though.
Yeah,
But I also say they would have been on such a high after completing the march. We were on such a high, and it was nothing compared to what they were. And they had protection for that week, although the protection didn't keep them from getting people yelling at them and throwing things at them. But the moment that they reached the Capitol, the protection disappeared. So it suddenly became more dangerous, just like
What
that.
was
They
the
may not-
protection? State troopers and that sort of thing?
Well, the National Guard.
They called out the National Guard
They
for
called
this?
out the National Guard to protect people, yeah,
Hmm.
all the way. But anyway, they started getting nervous, and I listened to an NPR interview with Leroy Moten that was just a couple of years old. He now lives in Hartford, Connecticut, and I couldn't find out what he does now, although he goes around and gives talks about civil rights to schools in Connecticut, but I don't know what he does to make a living or what he has done to make
Is
a
that a
living.
contemporary picture?
No, that's when he was 19, that was then. I couldn't find a contemporary picture of him. He says they were both nervous and they began singing freedom songs to keep their courage up. And there was one song, "Oh Freedom," which I'll play for you if I can. Oh, my.
Oh, all you have to do is hit the play button when you turn it on. I mean, I set it up for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is recorded in Brown's Chapel. Anyone know this song? Okay, that was the actual congregation of, this is not what we want,
That's it.
Let me
of
say
Brown
something
Chapel.
About being afraid. New Testament basically says over and over again, do not be afraid. But there's plenty to be afraid of. These people were taking risks. They knew they were taking risks, but that's part of their heritage.
They also thought it was worth the risk.
Right, it's not about being safe all the time.
So the reason I played that song is because in this interview, Moten, who was the only person who would know this, it sounds apocryphal, but he was there, so he would know, they started singing freedom songs to keep their courage up, and they were singing that song, "Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave," when the car pulled up alongside of them and shots rang out, and she was hit in the head and killed instantly. So that, if Leroy Moten is right, that was what she was singing when she was murdered. Here's her car. The car she was driving, he tried to grab the steering wheel. They went about 100 yards, went off and ditch into this pasture where they were stopped by, there's a fence there. He was not harmed, he was not hit, but he was, of course, terrified. And he saw the headlights of an approaching car, and he played dead. He got down on the floor of the front seat and smeared her blood all over him, so that it would look like he was bleeding too. And he heard men get out of the car. He heard them approaching. They shone a flashlight into this car, into their car, and said, "We got them." And then they left. So Leroy Moten, was literally saved by the blood of Viola Liuzzo. The next day, the FBI announced the arrest of 4 white men, all Klan members in Liuzzo's murder, which was kind of unusual. That
The next day?
the very next
That
day.
was fast.
Well, here's why it was fast. Here's her car. Oops. That's her husband on the phone with the president. The reason it was so fast, and what they didn't announce at the time, is the reason that they could make those arrests so quickly was that one of the men in the car was a paid FBI informant. Rowe. Right, Gary Rowe. He provided the information leading to the arrest. The FBI maintained later that Rowe was not complicit in the murder. The 3 others were indicted, but Rowe was not. There's a whole lot of controversy about
It wasn't a lot
his
of
involvement.
controversy about that.
And some of it didn't come out until decades later, until the 70s. This book, which I recommend if you're interested in Viola Liuzzo, this is From Selma to Sorrow, The Life and Death of Viola Liuzzo. It's an easy read. Easy, it's hard, but it's not difficult reading, but the subject matter is hard. And there's so many ins and outs and details that you can get lost in them, and we won't go through all that. But there are conflicting reports about what happened. I didn't know till I read this book that Roe actually told the FBI the morning after that he was the person who pulled the gun, that he was the trigger person. He publicly said that he had a gun and he just pointed his out the window and pretended like he was shooting it, that he's not the one who fired the gun. The person who was charged with actually firing the gun is Colin Wilkie. Wilkie and one of the other men said that Roe fired the gun. So who knows? But they gave him polygraph tests, and Wilkie and I think it was Thomas both passed the polygraph test when they said that Roe was the murderer. They were all.
Roe confessed to the FBI?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But he
I
was
don't get that.
probably bragging for one thing.
But wouldn't it be his job to prevent something like that?
Well, this is. He was a
Just
member.
remember, informant.
He was a member of the Klan
He was a
himself.
Klan member. Oh, he's in.
He was a Klan member. They the FBI recruited him as a Klan member.
It's obviously morally
They're all
corrupted, but
morally
if you want
bankrupt.
to see a movie about something about this with Mississippi Burning,
Yeah.
Gene Hackman, you can get it on free if you're on Comcast or Netflix. It's a good take on that. It's a difficult thing. They claim that's the only way they get the information. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But this wasn't the only informant. They were all over the place.
But the question is, of course, they had said that they were going to go out and kill someone that night. And there's even,
That would be different.
and there was even some speculation that she was a target before this happened. There's a report that the Highway 80 was shut down by the state troopers, which remember were not the good guys in this. All traffic was stopped for 30 minutes between 8:15 and 8:45, which is when the murder took place. Now, did that? I don't know whether that really happened or not, but this book says that there were several people who were coming back from Montgomery to Selma who said that they were stopped, and said that the road was closed. So, who knows exactly what happened? There are no. I shouldn't say there are no, but there are few people who were pure in their motives in the law enforcement.
Yeah, just as an aside, did Leroy, did he ever say when he got out of the car, how did he walk? Did somebody pick him up? What?
He got out of the car. When he saw cars coming that he wasn't sure about, he dove back into a ditch. Then finally a truck came that had marchers in it, and he recognized, and so he waved them down. They stopped, and he was put in jail for 5 days, supposedly for his protection, but nobody knew where he was when he reported it to the police. So there's a whole lot of things that we don't know, a lot of rumors, but what happened almost immediately was that Hoover, to draw attention away from the fact that there was an FBI informant, who, as it later turns out, was also involved in beating up freedom riders, perhaps part of the group that bombed the church in Birmingham. There was a whole bunch of stuff that he was involved in, and the FBI did not want that to come out. That didn't come out for 10 years, when finally some reporters filed Freedom of Information Act, and after Hoover had died. But Hoover almost immediately went on the offensive against Viola Liuzzo and started a smear campaign against her. Johnson gave a speech and said, Mrs. Liuzzo, who went to Alabama to serve the struggle for peace, was murdered by the enemies of justice, who for decades have used the rope and the gun and tar and feathers to terrorize their neighbors. He described the Klan as a hooded society of bigots. But after he gave that speech, Hoover went into action. He advised LBJ not to call Jim Liuzzo. He said the man himself doesn't have too good a background, meaning he was a Teamster. Although there was, and that later evolved into he was involved in organized crime, which there's no evidence that he was. But the FBI, Hoover started that rumor. The woman had indications of needle marks in her arms where she had been taking dope. She was sitting very, very close to the Negro in the car. It had all the appearances of a necking party. That's what Hoover said.
You got
To
those other
LBJ.
quotes that you were reading? The quotes from the pamphlets that were out and about?
No, I
You don't have
didn't.
them with you?
Yeah. So rumors persisted that Jim was involved in organized crime, that Viola was promiscuous with black men and was a drug user. There was no evidence that any of this was true. The autopsy did not show that she had needle marks in her arms. Autopsy showed that she hadn't had sexual intercourse in a long time. But it was a smear campaign, and it worked. 2 weeks after her funeral, a cross was burned on their lawn in Detroit. On the day that the youngest daughter, Sally, who was 6, went back to school, she remembers these people, grown-ups, lined the street and were throwing rocks at me, calling me a nigger lover's baby. I didn't know what that meant. 6 years old, her mother's just murdered. The Ladies' Home Journal wrote that she should have stayed home and minded her own business. The general opinion was that she had deserted her children. No one made that claim against James Reeb, who we talked about last week, who had 4 young children and was their sole source of support, financial support. No one, he was a hero. She was, a slut, basically, is what the common opinion was.
It sounds like Hoover also didn't like her last name.
Well, probably
That
not.
though she herself was not Italian.
Right.
She was married to an Italian.
Hoover,
and therefore
yeah,
into
Hoover
organized
was-
crime and,
Yeah,
I mean, that just
of course.
makes,
He was,
and of course, not fair and blonde.
exactly.
Against her too.
Yeah.
Shall we check my family?
Yeah, I know. We know that all Italians, right? But Hoover would say that.
White-haired and blonde, blue eyes.
Yeah, she was,
That's
but
right.
yeah. This kind of stuff. In January, so this is just less than a year after she died, the Birmingham News ran an ad offering Liuzzo's bullet-ridden car for sale. And the text of the ad said, "Do you need a crowd getter? I have a 1963 Oldsmobile 2-door in which Mrs. Viola Liuzzo was killed. Bullet holes and everything intact. Ideal to bring in crowds." So people could use that for fundraisers. You could come and buy a ticket and see the car. Penny, one of the daughters, said that the smear campaign took the life right out of my father. He started drinking a lot. And the family really just went into a downward spiral. Of course, partly because of the death, but mostly this downward spiral was because of the smear campaign. Here they are trying to grieve when all of this other stuff, they had to hire armed guards to guard their home for 2 years. It was really, the death was awful, but what happened after the death was even worse. Wilkins, Eaton, and Thomas were all charged with murder and acquitted by an all-white jury. Later they were charged in federal court with violating Liuzzo's civil rights and were convicted and served 6 years each.
When was that?
That was in the, didn't write that down. That was pretty soon afterwards. Let's see what else we got here. Here's her funeral.
Was anybody ever convicted during that time?
No,
For any of the murders?
no.
Later,
Okay.
later, about
Wilkins,
20 years later,
Yeah.
some were tried.
Wilkins, Thomas Easton. Here's Rowe. May or may not have been the trigger man. In 77, Liuzzo's family filed suit against the FBI, saying that they should have been able to prevent the death and over the harassment and smear campaign. In 1983, it took that long for it to go to court. There was no jury for some reason. It was just the judge ruling, and he ruled in the FBI's favor and ruled that the family owed the FBI $80,000 in court costs, although that settlement was later dropped. In '78, Roe was indicted. The first trial, there was a hung jury, and the second trial, he was acquitted. So, we have Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reed, Viola Liuzzo. None of them were leaders of the movement. They were just everyday people who heeded the call to help. And the same could be said about the next one, Jonathan Daniels. Okay, here's the memorial that's to her. These are my pictures now, which is frequently, I read, defaced. A lot of times that there's, this is at the spot where she died. A lot of times people paint Confederate flags on it.
It's managed by the Park Service?
Actually, this was put up by the women of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Evelyn Lowry. When we were there, it was, well, I'm going to talk next week. We were actually there on the 50th anniversary of her death, but some of her daughters had been there, I guess maybe for Bloody Sunday, and so there was this wreath that was there. And these are all from the memorial. And this was from a slideshow that they did, the children did. Okay, Jonathan Daniels. Okay. March 20th, 1929 to August 20th, 1965. So, this is after the march and everything is over. But he was still considered one of the martyrs of the Selma movement, because he actually was in Selma for the march, and he came back and was working in voter rights, voter registration.
It was the summer, right?
The summer after, the same summer. I'm going to start with the words of the Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud from the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Okay, that's Mary's song 2,000 years ago, the song that she sang when the angel appeared to her and told her that she was going to have a baby who was going to be the Savior of the world. The reason we start with those words is because those words were what motivated Jonathan Daniel to go to Selma. He was 26 years old. He was a seminarian at the Episcopal Theological School in Boston when Mary's song led him to a string of events that culminated in his death. And he's considered a martyr by the Episcopal Church. He's on our church calendar on August 14th, which is not the day that he died.
So he was 36 if those dates are.
Those dates must not be right then, because he was 26. Okay. It should be 39, not 29. Okay. Thank you, I'll fix that. He was born in New Hampshire and became an Episcopalian as a teenager. He thought then about becoming a priest, but he thought about doing other things too, and he went to graduate school at Harvard to pursue a degree in English literature, I think. But on Easter 1963, in the Episcopal Church of the Advent in Boston, Daniels had what he called a profound conversion experience, which renewed his desire to become a priest. So he enrolled in seminary that fall. So 2 years later, after that, Daniels and his fellow seminarians, like a lot of the nation, watched in horror as the news from Selma, Alabama, on Bloody Sunday. And after Bloody Sunday, as we've said, King the next day announced that they would attempt to march again and called on clergy and students and people of faith from across the country to come to Selma to join them. The news of that reached the students at the seminary that evening, right before they had evening prayer every evening. And Mary's song, the Magnificat, was part of the worship every evening. And this is a quote from Jonathan Daniel. I had come to evening prayer as usual that evening, and as usual I was singing the Magnificat with the special love and reverence I have always felt for Mary's glad song. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. He has showed strength with his arm. As the lovely hymn continued, I found myself peculiarly alert, suddenly straining toward the decisive, luminous, spirit-filled moment. Then it came. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things. At that moment, I knew I must go to Selma. So within hours, he and several other seminarians were on their way. And he was part of the march. When the march was over, he decided that he wanted to stay. So he received permission from the seminary to continue, that he could do his studies from afar, but he had to go back in May to take exams, which he did. He lived with a black family in Selma, and one of his projects was an attempt to integrate Selma's Episcopal Church. The first time he met with the priest, the rector told him it was the usher's responsibility to decide who would be admitted to services. Those of you who are ushers. So when Daniels and his black friend showed up, the ushers refused to let them in. So they kept coming back, Sunday after Sunday. After weeks of trying, they were grudgingly allowed to sit on the back row, but forced to wait to take communion until everyone else had received the sacrament and returned to their seats. So Daniels wrote a letter to the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama, Bishop Carpenter, who we've talked about, one of the people who inspired the King's letter from the Birmingham jail. So Daniels wrote him a letter protesting the segregation of the sacrament, adding it was obvious that church officials did not want the white congregation to have to drink from a chalice that had been tainted by being touched by black lips. The bishop replied that Daniels and his friends should wait humbly and thankfully for your turn at the Lord's table. And Daniels replied, there's a difference between humility and humiliation. He did go back to Cambridge to take his exams in May. And friends there who were fearful for his safety urged him not to go back to Alabama. But he told them, and a lot of this comes from this book, American Martyr, the story of Jonathan Daniels, I have promises to keep. I told my friends in Selma I would be back soon. They trust me. If I don't return this summer, why should they ever trust any white man again? So he went back. And when he went back for the summer, he concentrated his efforts on voter registration in Lowndes County, which is not Selma. Selma is Dallas County, but Lowndes is the next county, and then Montgomery. Lowndes County had a population that was 81% black and did not have one black person registered to vote. One of his colleagues there was a Catholic priest from Chicago, Richard Morrisseau. I don't think I got a picture of him. Working with children there. Okay. On August 14th, Daniels and Morrisseau accompanied a group, many of them teenagers, to Fort Deposit, Alabama, another little crossroads there, to peacefully demonstrate in front of stores that refused to serve blacks. Soon there was a crowd of angry and armed whites around them, and the 29 protesters were arrested. They were put in the back of a garbage truck and taken to the jail in neighboring Hayneville. Right here, this is the jail. They were put, 29 of them, in 3 cells with stopped-up toilets, no bathing facilities, and poor food. Bail was set at $100 each. Someone showed up to pay Jonathan Daniels bail, but he's decided that he would not leave until they were all free. They made that decision, that they would all be released at the same time. 6 days later, they were released without warning, just the middle of the afternoon. Somebody came and opened the door and said, you're released. In the hot August sun, there was no one there to take them home. They hadn't known that they were going to be released, so they hadn't made arrangements to have somebody get them. One group went in search of a phone. Daniels, Morrisseau, the Catholic priest, and 2 black teenage girls, Ruby Sales and Joyce Bailey, went to get a cold drink at the one store in town that served blacks. This is it, although it's not a store anymore.
What is it?
It's insurance company. Okay. As they approached the store, a man with a shotgun stepped out in front of them. Tom Coleman, who was a deputy sheriff. The store is closed, he said. If you don't get off this property, I'm going to blow your brains out. Ruby Sales, who was 16 at the time, she's an Episcopal priest now, described what happened then. The next thing I knew, someone pulled me from behind. I heard a shotgun blast and I looked and saw John falling. I lay down on the ground, then I heard another shotgun blast and I saw Father Morrisseau fall on the ground. And he lay there moaning for help, and he was just moaning, moaning, moaning. Jonathan Daniels died immediately. For 30 minutes, Coleman stood guard with his shotgun over Morrisseau's body, refusing to let anyone come to his aid. He did survive. And all who survived witnessed the shootings, and there were several others besides the 4 who were immediately involved. They all agreed that Daniels laid down his own life to save Ruby Sales. Coleman was acquitted by a jury of his peers. Here's his funeral, Jonathan Daniels' funeral. There's Tom Coleman. His sister was the superintendent of schools for Lowndes County. I met the night that we talked about the martyrs, the 3rd day of the march. We went to Selma for dinner. We had decided, that we needed to go back to Selma and spend some money there. That all of our money was going to Montgomery, and so we wanted to go back to Selma. So my friend Logan, the young Jewish woman who's a vegetarian, who loved ribs, let us take a picture of her eating them. She found a barbecue place in Selma that we were going to go to. And so she led us there, and we ended up in the poorest section of Selma. A lot of houses that were boarded up, a lot that were not well kept, but very modest. And we walked in this hole-in-the-wall barbecue place, and we were the only white people there. And everybody started talking to us, wanting to know why we were there. And they were thrilled that we were, when they heard why we were there. And I had sat down, and a woman came up to me, and she said, "They just told me why you're here." And she, I didn't put her picture in, but she had been, she's probably my age, so she had been about 9 or 10 when the march happened, and her mother wouldn't let her march, but her older brother did. And they went every night to the campsites. And helped cook and feed. But she said that Jonathan Daniels had come to their house for dinner many times. She knew all these people.
Did she ask you whether you knew him?
Yeah. Yes, she did. And so she said that Tom Coleman was from a very prominent family, and there was no way that he was the deputy sheriff. His sister was superintendent of schools. They were, among the, if you can have elite in Hayneville, Alabama, which I'll tell you is not a very exciting place to be, they were it. That's Ruby Sales. Then,
Where is she a priest now?
I can't remember. She's not in a church. She works in an agency, has a foundation or something. But that's her now. And every year, got more, but I'll leave that alone. But every year, in Hayneville, Alabama, and they pronounce it Hayneville there, not Hayneville. They remember his death, and there's a procession from the jailhouse to the store to the courthouse, which is, about as big as this room. All that distance, they're all right next to each other. But they remember him. There's a procession. In fact, I didn't realize that. That's Rob.
Yeah, that's what
And then they have Eucharist in the courthouse where Tom Coleman was acquitted. And I think we're gonna go. This year will be the 50th anniversary, and we're gonna go down. And so, if anybody's interested in making that pilgrimage, but you see, these are all from that. It's a pretty big deal. Okay, this is the memorial. We went the first day. We decided to go try to find Hayneville and the memorial. And here it is. It's on the corner of, it's right across the street from, so pretty much in front of the place. The store where he was trying to get in was right here. So this is really close to where he died. Notice that it was given by his class from VMI.
Tricia, could you read at least part of the inscription?
Yeah, I think the next one might be a little bit bigger. In memory of Jonathan Myrick Daniels, VMI class of 1961. I can't read. I'll have to get it off. I can't read what it says. I'll find it though and have it for you next week. The interesting thing is that it's literally in the shadow of the courthouse where his killer was acquitted. And in between is a huge monument to the Confederate war dead. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, and
there.
those monuments weren't put up until the 30s, or when were those
Around the
monuments
turn of
put
the
up?
century, I just read something about that.
The monuments.
They were mass produced with the same figure,
Yeah.
and in New England or somewhere, out of marble, and every southern city has one.
Yeah.
Same pose for the Confederate as opposed to.
But I also think it's interesting that that these monuments are not, that it wasn't put up by the government or the people of the town. It was put up by his classmates from VMI. And so I just find that interesting.
What kind of, is that public land in its own? How do they get
I don't
permission
know.
to do it?
I don't know. That's a good question. Certainly this is the courthouse square area.
Yeah.
So they must have, probably grudgingly given them a little spot of land.
When do you think that was put up?
That,
That's pretty new, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I'll have to find that out.
Might have come after the political changes.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
Because the rest of those monuments that you see put up by the Southern Leadership Conference, the women of the SCLC, are all fairly, well, they were probably put up in maybe the 80s, I think, maybe 70s or 80s.
These little towns now, with the vote, could easily have black government.
Well, Selma has a
Probably
black
do.
mayor now.
Yeah.
And I don't know about
So was-
Hayneville, but I can't describe to you how little and in the middle of nowhere this is. And 50 years ago, it must have been even more so. I mean, there's the jail, you can, well, and which they did, but I mean, the jail is just like right here, the store's here, the courthouse is here, and there's not much else around there. Because we thought, well, maybe we'll eat dinner here. There was no place to eat dinner.
So was Coleman ever retried?
Now the woman in the barbecue place said he had a pretty miserable life though, and she said he died a pretty awful death, and then she wouldn't elaborate, but she didn't seem to upset her too much, and rightly so. But he was. I asked, was he ever repentant, and she said, oh no. So next week we'll finish this up next week, day 4 and day 5, back to the march. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.